To Myanmar next, where fierce fighting between insurgent groups and the military government is pushing the nation towards collapse. Myanmar's military staged a coup in 2021, strangling democratic reforms and jailing much of the country's civilian leadership. 3 years on, tens of thousands of people have been killed in the ongoing battle for control. This map shows how much territory is controlled by the resistance and which areas are controlled by the military junta, as well as areas that are still heavily contested. A central point in the battle for territory and control of the country has been the town of Myawaddy on Myanmar's eastern border with Thailand.
In the Myanmar city of Myawaddy this week, explosions and smoke rising from buildings, attacked by helicopters overhead. Resistance fighters say they have, for now, partially withdrawn from the critical border city with Thailand, which they seized only earlier this month. Their retreat follows a counter-offensive by the military junta, which seized control of Myanmar in a 2021 coup, plunging the country into violent chaos. Fighting in Myawaddy has caused thousands to flee into neighbouring Thailand, although Thailand's foreign ministry said on Wednesday some had since returned. This is why Myawaddy is so important. Two of only a handful of border crossings between Myanmar and Thailand are located in the city, and more than $1 billion of trade passes through Myawaddy each year. Control of the city means control of an economic lifeline to Myanmar. Thailand has warned Myanmar's military junta not to allow fighting to spill over the border and has proposed an ASEAN-wide meeting to resolve the crisis. But a peaceful solution looks distant. The situation in Myanmar remains enormously complex, with resistance groups opposed to the junta at times also fighting each other. Elsewhere, there's particular concern for the Rohingya people in Myanmar's northern Rakhine state. There, the mostly Muslim ethnic group is caught in the crossfire of fierce fighting between military and opposition forces. The current violence, a potential escalation of the brutal 2017 crackdown by the military, which killed tens of thousands of Rohingyas and caused hundreds of thousands to flee Myanmar.
Whereas in 2017, the Rohingya were targeted by one group, they are now trapped between two armed factions who have a track record of killing them.
But beneath the junta's veneer of control, a country crumbling. The United Nations estimates some 18 million people in the country currently require humanitarian assistance, about a third of the population.
Let's get more now from Jason Tower. He's the country director of the Burma program for the United States Institute for Peace, an independent institute that aims to solve and prevent conflicts abroad. Jason, welcome. The resistance currently controls more than half of Myanmar's territory. Are the military junta's days in power numbered?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I mean, you really are seeing that this is becoming increasingly existential for the Myanmar military. It's lost well over 30,000 square kilometers of territory to resistance forces just since last October. It's lost control over key logistics corridors with India, with China, and with Bangladesh. And you're now seeing that critical battles are playing out as we're speaking here along the China border, which could further push it away from that border and cause it to lose further control over the China border trade, as well as the situation in Myawaddy, which is where the military is just barely hanging on to control over that critical trade artery with Thailand. Meanwhile, in Rakhine State, you're seeing where the military is also similarly up against the ropes and stands to lose control over territories through which strategic and oil and gas bound for China pass through. Meanwhile, the resistance is increasingly able to perpetrate airstrikes, drone strikes that are able to hit even into the capital of Naypyidaw. You saw one of those a few weeks ago, and you've also seen strikes in Mon State as well.
You know, you call this existential for the military junta, and you also mentioned the fighting on the borders with China. So therefore, I would like to talk about China because Myanmar's junta, the Myanmar junta's home minister, has left for China for security talks with the public security minister there. What do you expect here from Beijing, given that this is becoming an existential problem for the military junta?
Yeah, well, I mean, for Beijing, there's hundreds of billions of dollars in investments at stake. There is a geostrategic oil and gas corridor that cuts through the country, which represents roughly 10% of the GDP of Yunnan province. Plus, it's the only pipeline that China has to the south. So it's of critical importance. Now, China has very close relations with belligerent parties, including 7 ethnic armed organizations that are some of the most powerful of the EAOs in its border area and with the Myanmar military. And it's been using the leverage that it has over each of these parties to try to push them to enter into agreements with one another and to try to push them also to secure and stabilize Chinese investments in the country. Another major interest is cracking down on crime, which has harmed Chinese interests and which has resulted in billions of dollars in losses to China. A lot of this criminal activity is under the protection of the Myanmar military, and I think that's precisely the topic that the Home Minister is going to be touching on with China during this visit. Right. Following a major crackdown in the China border on this crime, which took place over the last couple of months, Chinese police have growing evidence that the Myanmar military is directly involved in a lot of this criminal activity at very high levels, and it continues to put pressure on the military to deal with these problems.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us today, Jason Tower.
Thanks for having me on.
For more on this, let's bring in Mark Farmaner. He's director of Burma Campaign UK. That's a London-based NGO that rallies support for the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. Welcome to the program. Mark, how do you see it? Do the rebel groups pose a real threat to the junta's grip on power?
Yeah, the military is under greater threat now than any time since the independence of the country. I think they've lost control of huge swathes of the country, and I think for decades they've been playing this divide and rule game between ethnic groups and within ethnic groups, and that game is no longer working for them. We're seeing more unity now and more cooperation between different ethnic groups, all fighting the military at the same time, and they're simply not able to cope. We've also seen the big difference being that many of the Bama, the main ethnic group in Burma, they've now formed many of their own so-called PDFs, People's Defense Forces, and they've joined with the ethnic armies and are fighting the Burmese military at the same time. So it's an absolutely desperate time for the military at the moment, and that's why we're seeing them using such brutal tactics, airstrikes against civilian targets, indiscriminate shelling and bombing across the country now. They're panicking.
Now, there are multiple militias fighting against the junta's troops. It's a very diverse society. You say there's a lot of unity there. Do the rebel groups really have common cause? Do they all want the same thing?
Well, they have common cause in they want to see the military gone. Perhaps they have not all got exactly the same vision of what comes afterwards, but there is between the larger ethnic groups, the Karen National Union, the Kachin Independence Organization, and others, there is a lot of behind-the-scenes cooperation, behind-the-scenes communication and coordination and assistance happening to each other. But yeah, there's also other smaller armed groups that perhaps they've split from the main ethnic armies in the past because of the military using these divide and rule tactics. And their loyalties are more to themselves, more to their own power, their power base, their revenue streams, rather than any overriding support for human rights and democracy like the larger ethnic armed groups have.
Okay. How is this civil war affecting the civilian population in Myanmar?
It's a dreadful humanitarian and human rights crisis across the country. More than 3 million people displaced, enormous suffering. People are in areas now that are liberated from control of the Burmese military, but also that's the UN agencies, most international aid agencies, they don't operate there. So there's very little assistance getting through to people. So the situation is as dire as I've ever seen it in 25 years of working at Burma Campaign UK. I visited Karen State just at the end of last year, crossing the border there to see. And it's the suffering, the human rights violations, the things that people are going through are absolutely dreadful. But at the same time, strangely, even though things are worse than ever, there's more hope than ever, because people are thinking, yes, the situation is absolutely dreadful now, but finally, perhaps we have a chance to get rid of the Burmese military. Finally, we can be free of them, and then we can go about having human rights, economic development, democracy, and the other things that people in the country are so desperate for.
Mark, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Mark Farmaner with Burma Campaign UK.
Thank you.